thought what I would do is pick up where Stephen left off by talking about the Middle East peace process and the situation that the new Israeli government and the second-term Obama administration face as they try to get some momentum back into that process. It is a crossroads moment, I think. One can see that if there's no political movement between Israel and the Palestinians, dangers ahead. I agree that the status quo is not sustainable. But there's also a window of opportunity to revive the Middle East peace process, I think. And moving into that window of opportunity and making the most of it depends, and again, agreement with Steve, on not overreaching. So that's what I want to say today. Where are we? It's important to register that the process has been frozen for some time, and to just review some of the reasons for that, because the reasons give us a sense of how difficult it's going to be to make further progress. The first reason it's been frozen is there are genuine gaps. In Europe especially, there's often a phrase that we all know the solution, as if it's just a matter of Israel not showing the political will. Well, we don't really all know the solution. Whether it's refugees, Jerusalem, borders, land swaps, security, Jordan Valley, demilitarization, contiguity of a Palestinian state, there are gaps. At Annapolis, there were some 30 meetings over 3 years, and at the end of the process, Mahmoud Abbas says there are gaps. So that's the first reason the process has been frozen. Secondly, there's been a real collapse of trust between the leaderships, and a collapse of faith amongst the two peoples in the idea of the two-state solution and in each other. Thirdly, I think a US policy error, which I think has been realized by the Obama administration, which is that making settlement freeze the issue was a big mistake. Mahmoud Abbas said it was the equivalent of walking him up a tree, and then Obama taking the ladder away and leaving Mahmoud Abbas up the tree. It was very difficult for a Palestinian leader, once the American president has said a settlement freeze is the issue, for it not to be the issue for the Palestinian national movement too. I think we've hopefully moved on from that. Fourthly, I think the Palestinians have turned in a strategic way to unilateralism, internationalizing the dispute, legalizing the dispute, seeking to use the institutions of the United Nations to gain leverage in the process, and also being in cahoots with the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, to try to isolate Israel. All of that doing no good at all for the kind of atmosphere of trust that's necessary to bring the parties around the table. Fifth reason has been the rise of Hamas. There's an expression, everything now is like Noah's Ark, two of everything, two policies, two foreign ministers, two governments, and so on. That in itself is a problem. How do you negotiate with a split movement in that way? But reconciliation would equally be a problem if it's an unreformed Hamas. A Hamas still committed to Israel's destruction. And the sixth factor has been the Arab Spring itself. It has made the security environment much more difficult for Israel to make any sort of risks for peace. It has eroded some of the support for Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah from the Arab states. It has put great pressure on the Palestinians to unify on the basis of resistance and increasingly on Hamas's terms. It means Abbas has found it much more difficult to take risks in the atmosphere that exists now of populism and the rise of Islamism in the region. So all those factors have created a kind of dynamic which is a kind of drift towards one state. And again, Benjamin Netanyahu has said he does not intend to preside over a drift towards binationalism by Israel. I think the status quo is untenable in the short and longer terms. In the short term, there are real dangers. There's a possibility of the continued fiscal crisis in the Palestinian Authority, producing the kind of unrest that we saw last September in Palestinian cities aimed at the Palestinian Authority. That could get worse. There could be riots. We spoke to people in Ramallah only recently, Palestinians who said the danger was of when the Palestinian security forces aren't being paid, then they begin to break up into militias. The militias begin to fight each other, challenge the authority of the Palestinian Authority itself, and you get a downward spiral. There is a danger in the absence of a process of a negative cycle developing. We saw it to some degree recently when we see the Palestinians going to the UN for recognition of Palestinian state. Israel's response in part was to make some announcements over zoning and planning agreements in the E1, at which point the Palestinians mooted the idea of taking Israel to the International Criminal Court, at which point it was clear that if that happens, the tax revenues will not be transferred. And so we go into a downward spiral. So I think everyone has a stake in stopping that downward spiral, putting some blocks in there and making the process move in the other direction, changing the dynamic. Now, how can that take place? I think there's two kind of options around at the moment in the international community that are being talked about. So briefly, the first is a very ambitious drive. The Europeans talk about this, I know the UK government talks about this, and it has this dream of an E3, Britain, France and Germany, uniting together under American leadership, involving some Arab states, and having what they would call, when they talk to you, an intense Oslo-like push for peace. It often goes along with the language of time is running out, and sometimes a year, 18 months and so on is talked about. When there was a press conference recently with John Kerry and William Hague said, the British Foreign Secretary, that this was the most burning issue on the British government's agenda and on the world's agenda. Interestingly, John Kerry's response was, yes, we're looking at ways to begin talking. It was a very much more muted response, which said, let's take it easy, let's not get ahead of ourselves here, which I thought was interesting. It could be dangerous to make that kind of a push because we're really not near that kind of a deal, and a premature forcing of the parties into final status talks could be very, very risky. The Palestinians are split, the region itself is in turmoil, and Abbas is in no position to make compromises at the moment. The alternative approach, I think, which we spell out in a BICOM paper by Brigadier General retired Michael Herzog, is focus on the next steps. Don't go for end of conflict now, go for a two-state dynamic rather than a two-state solution. Forget for a moment the dream of the flashbulbs popping on the White House lawn, Palestinian and Israeli leaders shake hands and we all head off into the sunset and look for new jobs. That's not really on the cards. An alternative approach would have these kind of components, I think. Certainly US leadership. It remains the indispensable nation for the process. The US needs to invest in it, to lead an international effort, and this leadership is essential to halt the negative dynamic I talked about. So building trust between the parties, exploring positions, persuading the parties not to make any unilateral measures, commitment for a period of time to confidence building measures. And that would really be the second element, I think, in a more cautious, more incremental approach. Look at the kind of confidence building measures that could be taken by both sides. So some of the ideas that Michael Herzog raises are, for instance, a partial freeze in settlement activity may be something that emerges from the new Israeli government. That seems like it's an idea in the air, outside the blocks and so on, for a period of time, in return for other measures on the other side, of course. Possibility to allow the Palestinian Authority an increased economic role in Area C, even some partial civil control, allowing the security forces a bigger role in areas A and B, possibly some prisoner releases, and so on. From the Palestinian side, no legal actions, no seeking, no UN memberships, agree to start substantive negotiations with a credible back channel, maintain security coordination with Israeli in the West Bank, and avert reconciliation with Hamas until Hamas agrees the quartet conditions. Not all of this has to be made public. The process can be fed with other confidence-building measures as it proceeds. But this kind of an approach acknowledges the reality that we're in at the moment, acknowledges the reality of the last 20 years, of the Arab Spring, the degrading security environment, and so on. Because just think for a second of the environment in which Israel is being expected to make risks for peace. Just as you work your way around the map, it now has something like 60,000 rockets in the hands of Hezbollah aimed at Israel from the north. When we look over to Syria, we're hearing reports of Al-Qaeda operatives wandering around the Golan Heights border, filming the IDF and sticking those films on YouTube. We have loose chemical and biological weapons, which the IDF and the Israeli security forces are intensely looking at to make sure they don't get into the wrong kinds of hands. We have the Iranian nuclear threat and the drift towards what we heard was called the zone of immunity. In the south, we have the Sinai Desert becoming a dead zone, with terror gangs inflicting attacks not just on Israel but also on Egyptian forces. We have Hamas emboldened, feeling itself strengthened by the rise of Islam in the region, by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, by the fact that Qatar is promised $400 million while it won't meet with Abbas. this is not a security environment which is easy for Israel to take risks. Premature, intense negotiations might well produce an outcome that those sponsoring them do not want to see. So that's an alternative approach, I think, is to work with the political reality on both sides, stop things getting worse, avoid a collapse of the PA, set realistic expectations of the end goal over the next year or so, look for incremental ways to move forward, and finally the language, get the language right. This language from a lot of European states, from my own state, of time is running out, I think is dangerous language, because how it's heard from the other side by the extremists is, if I bide my time will come. It looks as if there's a loss of will and a loss of confidence in the two-state solution from the Western backers. So instead, a language of resolve, of determination, that there's no alternative to the two-state solution, a secure Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state, and support the moderates and oppose the extremists. That kind of language would be much more suitable, I think. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.